Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever it is you are watching this. Today, we are going to be talking about the history of apartheid in South Africa for paper one for prescribed subject 4, rights and protest. So please don't panic. If you're looking down in the bottom of this slide player, you'll notice there's 54 slides here. I'm not going to be covering all of them. Someone else made this slide player presentation, and while I appreciate it for being very thorough and covering basically everything I need you to know, it's a little too thorough and it has much more information in it than you need to know. So I will be skipping around quite a bit here. So, what do you need to know? For the prescribed subject 4, rights and protest, the history goes from the 1948 victory of the National Party in the South African elections, which is the event that directly leads to the passage of apartheid laws, all the way up through 1964 with the Rivonia trial and the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. I'll give you a little bit of context for earlier, but not a whole lot because you really just need to focus on this time frame. So, what is apartheid? Just to clarify, apartheid is a word in Afrikaans, which is the white settler language of South Africa. It's very closely related to Dutch, and it means apartness. And it is literally the act of separating the white South Africans from the native Black South Africans, as well as separating the white South Africans and the Black South Africans from the Indian settlers in South Africa and the coloreds, who would be considered the mixed race people. So, creating clear, very arbitrary distinctions in South Africa based on race. And the idea behind apartheid is that there is this natural hierarchy amongst different races of people, and that obviously the white races would be at the top of this hierarchy due to all of their vast cultural achievements. And if you cannot tell, I'm being a little sarcastic through this recording. But yes, this is very much an extension of the social Darwinism, the scientific racism, just the general racism that was such a big part of white European imperialism in Africa that started in the 1800s and continued into the 1900s. This idea that white people are inherently superior to Black people and that the governments of countries in Africa should reinforce these hierarchies and promote this ideology. So you may notice I've jumped ahead to the 1948 election for a little bit of backstory just to get you caught up to 1948. The early history of European colonialism in South Africa was that the Cape of South Africa, the coastline of South Africa, was first discovered by the Portuguese as they were attempting to find access to the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. But it really was the Dutch who first started settling in South Africa as actual colonists, moving into the area and often becoming farmers. And hopping forward from there, the British soon started exerting influence in South Africa after it was discovered that South Africa had very rich natural resource deposits, especially of diamonds and other natural resources that could make Great Britain very wealthy. So there was a bit of a conflict between the local Dutch descended colonists, farmers, citizens of this area and the British government that was trying to come in and establish a claim here. And of course, you also still had native South Africans, native African peoples who were trying to, exist and continue living in their native homeland. Ultimately, the British government won, and South Africa became sort of a semi independent colony of Great Britain. And the white population of South Africa over time became this mix of British and Dutch descended immigrants. So that's why you get a new language, Afrikaans. But if you go to South Africa today, a lot of them speak English because there's that British Dutch mix of heritage there. So prior to 1948, which is when the curriculum really picks up, there had been a bit of segregation going on, for several decades, attempts by the government to limit interaction between the white South Africans, the Black South Africans, Indian South Africans, and others. But it is in 1948 when D.F. Malan's National Party wins the elections that segregation becomes the rule of law throughout the country. That was kind of what D.F. Malan's National Party campaigned on, and Malan, as the prime minister, will really emphasize apartheid as being the key component of his legislation. So you could definitely argue there's a history of segregation well before 1948, attempts, like I said, to limit interactions between racial groups, but it's not until 1948 that apartheid laws start to become the rule of the land, and every aspect of life in South Africa becomes governed by this policy of separation. So I've talked about this earlier, but it is important to understand the difference between petty apartheid and grand apartheid. So petty apartheid comes first. It is more associated with the National Party rule under D.F. Malan and Stridham, who I believe I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. Those are just prime ministers, leaders of Great Britain. And this is more in line with the Jim Crow laws of the U.S. South. Very brutal subjugation of the Native African population, even though the Native African population was the majority of the South African population. And these were the laws that were passed to create separate, water fountains, beaches, parks, schools, to ban interracial marriage, to limit where Black South Africans and white South Africans could go to school, what jobs they could hold, things like that. So again, you think very much Jim Crow laws, the stuff that we studied about segregation in the South in the United States, and that's your petty apartheid. Grand apartheid, which we looked at a little bit when we practiced paper one, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever you're watching this, was more instituted by Prime Minister Verwoerd, who you did read a little bit about in the practice paper one we did in the late 1950s. And you guys even read part of that law. That was more sophisticated ideologically, because rather than just legislating the behavior of Black, white, Indian, colored South Africans where they stood, the goal of grand apartheid was to literally relocate all of the Black South Africans into roughly 13% of the territory, basically these reservations. They called them Bantustans, and to create like totally new homelands for the Black South Africans. Again, reservations that the United States created for Native Americans would be very analogous here. And H.F. Verwoerd's argument for this was that, they couldn't possibly be oppressing the Black South Africans if they were giving them their own land, their own governments, political, economic, social, cultural autonomy. And so that was the grand vision. And there were very big moves towards this. A lot of people were forcibly relocated out of South Africa's larger cities and into these Bantustans, but it wasn't completely achieved by the time that apartheid collapsed. So now we're just going to look at some of the laws that were related to petty apartheid, grand apartheid, and I'm going to be skipping around quite a bit because for some reason these slides are not in chronological order. So I'll kind of be redoing this in chronological order. So the first one, the most important one, the one that kind of lays the foundation for all of the others, is the Population Registration Act of 1950. And this slide is actually a little incorrect. It says it split the population into 3. It actually split the population into 4 groups. The missing group here is Indians. Remember, because South Africa is right there on the Indian Ocean, you did have a lot of people from South Asia, from the Indian Peninsula, coming, or subcontinent, I'm sorry, coming to South Africa as part of their work or just seeking economic opportunities. And so there was a decent sized population of people from India, and that was a separate subcategory under the Population Registration Act. But you did also have whites, Bantu, which were the native, fully Africans in South Africa, and then coloreds, which here meant mixed race. In the United States, we use the word colored to mean African American. Here it means mixed race. So this was very arbitrary. And this is kind of the thing when it comes to scientific racism, or trying to create these arbitrary racial categories. We talk about the biology of a person, we talk about their DNA, their ancestry, whatever, and there are markers of race that you can identify. For example, the pencil test, which I thought was so interesting. Like, if you stick a pencil in your hair and it stays, then your hair is curly or coily enough to count you as being Native African. But if it falls out, you count as white. But it is very important to remember that these are all just arbitrary guidelines that the South African government set to break people up by race. And race is not that simple. So, you actually had examples of people being like taking some of these tests, either based on linguistic proficiency or measuring the skull shape, which was a 19th century way of supposedly being able to tell the race of a human being, and being classified as one race the first time they took the test. And yet, taking that same test later and being reclassified into different racial categories. This really happened with people. They would, take this supposedly super scientific, super accurate test, and yet the same test would put them in one category one time and a different category and another time. So, it just drives home the fact that this was all very pseudoscientific, and yet biology, genetics, these things were used to try and justify why this was being done. And so whatever race you ended up being classified into, that code was put into your national ID number so that everybody would know basically how you were classified. So even if you were a colored person, a mixed race person whose skin was very, very white, and whose hair might look very European, you could pass as white theoretically. Your code in your national ID number would give you away. And if you thought your neighbor was trying to sneak around this, and you thought your neighbor technically counted as colored, but they were trying to pass for white, you could report people as trying to get around these laws. This did lead to a lot of babies being abandoned or just treated with quite a bit of social stigma. Actually, Trevor Noah, who is the host of The Daily Show, the comedian Trevor Noah, was born into this society, and his mother was Bantu, his father was German, totally white, so he was colored, mixed race. And, he talked a lot about how his mother couldn't even hold his hand when they were walking down the street, because his existence, I mean, his autobiography that he wrote was called Born a Crime, because, as you'll see later, another behavior that was limited by apartheid was having interracial sexual relations. And that was what his parents did. And so his birth, his existence was criminal in South Africa. And because he looked so light-skinned and very clearly mixed race, his mother couldn't really claim him in public because he and his existence was evidence that she had committed a crime. So here is the specific act that made Trevor Noah's existence a crime. And it is just so wild to me that, people would tip off the police about their neighbors, and often police would burst into homes in the middle of the night, hoping to catch people in the act of having extramarital sexual relations with someone who was not in their racial category, which just seems like such a wild violation of privacy. But this isn't the United States, it's South Africa, so they didn't have quite the same, constitutional concerns about that. And if you were caught in the act breaking the Immorality Act of 1950, you could be sent to prison for it. Another law passed in 1950 was the Group Areas Act, which D.F. Malan called the essence of apartheid. And this made it so that the centers of the large South African cities could only be white residents. Black people were not allowed to live there. And so this resulted in up to a quarter of the non-white population of South Africa being forced to move. And we'll look at some examples of neighborhoods that were cleaned out as a result of this. And, this is going to kind of contribute to what will eventually become grand apartheid. So you don't need to copy all of this slide, but you should just also know, if you don't remember already, that one of the laws that was passed as part of apartheid that really came to dominate people's lives was the Pass Laws Act, which required that any Black person in South Africa had to constantly carry pass books on them at all times. These were 96 pages long, so literally like small books that contained information about your job, your criminal history, your tax records. And that this would be what allowed Black South Africans into certain neighborhoods, specifically like for work and things like that. Literally any white person, not just police, could demand to see a Black person's pass at any time, which this didn't just like limit behavior. This would have been deeply psychologically scarring. If you just living your life, going about day to day, and any white person could stop you and demand to see your papers. That is extremely demeaning. And this just contributed to like the psychological torment that happened to the native Bantu peoples. And a lot of the anti-government protests that we will see happening centered around the pass laws and the pass books. And if you remember, the Defiance campaign was launched in protest against this specific law. So we'll talk about that later. So again, just to make sure that you're aware of the different behaviors that were limited by apartheid, this is all good evidence to include as outside knowledge for question 4 on paper 1, that mini essay that you have to write. So definitely try to remember the names of some of these laws. That's awesome. But if you can just remember things like pass books or separate amenities or, racial classification, that is good too. Pencil test, all of that would count as outside evidence, assuming, of course, that wasn't also explicitly discussed in the sources you're given. So all public amenities in 1953 were strictly segregated. Buses, trains, toilets, hospitals, entrances, service counters, and public amenities like post offices, waiting rooms, train station platforms, parks, beaches, swimming pools. Like, you can read all of this. And again, not only is this going to have a serious impact on the day-to-day lives of the Black people in South Africa, it is very humiliating and demeaning too, to be told like you no longer have access to the same things that white people have access to. And this is a massive symbol of the like second class status of Black people, especially because, again, just like with the Jim Crow laws in the South in the United States, this wasn't separate but equal. The amenities that Black South Africans had access to were often drastically inferior in quality. So it's not just like you have a separate thing, it's that what you get is far worse than what white people get. All right, one of the most egregious laws that was passed, in my opinion, but of course, maybe I think this because I'm a teacher, was the Bantu Education Act. And this served to reinforce the long-term inferiority of Black South Africans in South Africa by limiting their access to education. So it started by just being about separate schools. So every given school is only allowed to have children from a single racial group, but it was much, much more than just segregated school systems. The schools that were created for and designated for Black South Africans were explicitly required to teach a far less rigorous curriculum. So, almost no academic content. The students in these Black schools were only given basic skills with literacy and numbers. So, can you read and write at a basic level? Can you do basic level math? And everything else that these Black children were taught was technical education, vocational training for either domestic service or unskilled, labor for working in the diamond mines or manufacturing jobs. The purpose of this was to streamline students, these Black students, into low paying, back-breaking work with very little to no opportunity for economic advancement. You never even had the chance, if you were a Black child, to get the kind of education that could allow you to rise out of poverty. You were explicitly denied that. They attended school in 3-hour shifts, so they didn't even get like full school days. They were not given books or other essential school equipment, so they often just wrote on the ground in sticks. Government spending on white students was 7 times greater than government spending on Black students. And almost all of the Black teachers had no professional qualification to teach. So you might not be surprised to learn that as a result of this, many parents just took their children out of school. Like many Black parents took their children out of school. They recognized exactly what was happening. And they said, I'm not going to waste my child's time with this extremely subpar education that is only going to funnel them into jobs that they are much more, they are much better than. Some Black communities did make an attempt to kind of do their own sort of like homeschooling programs where a Bantu education, a Native African cultural education was provided so that they felt a stronger sense of community, that they could maybe try to rise above this. But in terms of actual formal education, students for generations were denied anything remotely resembling what we would consider a proper education. So we talked a little bit about this, but as the city centers were limited just to white citizens, you will get the forcible resettlement of Black communities that were previously in these white city centers, and they will be moved out to very inferior territory. And this will kind of almost be the beginning of these Bantustans that we will see formalized in 1959. So you have very vibrant Black communities, places like Sophiatown, Soweto, that are essentially like razed to the ground. Oh, yes, that is exactly the language used here on the slide. And these people are pulled out of their homes. They're often given very little time to prepare or pack or get their, finances in order. And they're just literally walked out of the city or bussed out of the city and dumped into these horrible slums and shanty towns that, they have no connection to. Often the communities they were pulled out of, their families had lived there for generations, but those communities are just totally destroyed and rebuilt for white South Africans. And these Black South Africans are forced to kind of start over from total scratch with no resources in parts of the country that often have nothing to offer in terms of natural resources either. So, as you might imagine, this results in immense poverty, immense levels of crime, just really, really bad social problems, which of course then the South African government will point to as evidence that these Black South Africans are racially and just biologically inferior. They're criminals, they're thugs, they're, you know, not as civilized as, we white South Africans are. When in reality, any community of people that was yanked out of their homes and dumped in the middle of nowhere with no way to support themselves is probably going to end up in those same situations. So, the last bit of petty apartheid legislation that I am going to talk about is the Extension of University Education Act, which basically just continues the higher level education, tertiary education. Sorry, there's weird things going on outside my bedroom. It continues the principles of apartheid out to the colleges and universities. So, not that a ton of Black students were going on to colleges and universities by this time anyway, because of the vastly inferior education they were getting at the lower levels, but this just cements the fact that universities will be for white students and Black students don't need to worry about it because you don't need a college degree to be a maid or a driver or to work in the mines. Moving on to Grand Apartheid, some of the laws that were passed in promotion of the Grand Apartheid program. The first one was Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, which is what you saw and what we were dealing with in the sample paper one that we did when we learned how to do paper one. This was passed by Verwoerd, who was the white prime minister at the time, and it divided the African population into distinct ethnic groups, each of these groups being assigned to a white commissioner general who basically was supposed to facilitate creating an independent area of South Africa for their homeland or their Bantustan. The justification of this was that this would give Black South Africans total political control over themselves. And so, how could they possibly complain? Because they get to basically, govern themselves and they don't get to be upset with the white government anymore. But what it really meant was that this was the white government kind of washing its hands of Black South Africans and totally eliminating any chance for Black political representation. And of course, as we've already learned and seen, the Bantustans, much like the Native American reservations, were not territory that would have been economically self-sufficient. These were not areas or homelands that had natural resources that would have allowed these people to actually flourish on their own. They were basically dumped into totally infertile patches of dirt or sand or rock and then told, hey, have fun. You guys own this. If you're not successful here, it's just because you're inferior and you're not as smart as white people, when in reality no one could have thrived in the parts of South Africa these homelands were created. So the Bantu Investment Corporation Act does really drive this home. And this, again, is just going to be very, very similar to the Native American reservations in the United States. So the idea was that if you move the Black South Africans to these homelands, you could also get businesses to relocate close to the Bantustans so that the businesses could take advantage of cheap labor. The assumption being that Black South Africans would be a source of cheap labor. But you never ended up getting businesses moving out to these Bantustans for a variety of reasons. This just never really came to fruition. And any thought that these Bantustans might be cultural centers for Native African pride was just a fantasy. These Bantustans were incredibly impoverished. Again, there were no jobs, no natural resources. The land was not sustainable for agriculture. or like raising animals. And so you had the development of crime, gambling, prostitution, drug and alcohol abuse as people tried to cope with the fact that there was no hope, no future, no opportunity for economic growth. And these just became real, like, moral cesspools. Again, not because the native Black South Africans are morally inferior naturally, but because any group of people historically, when put in these situations, will usually act this way. All right, some other notable laws that I wanted to draw your attention to, specifically the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950, which I think really does drive home the importance of the fact that all of this is happening against the global context of the Cold War. The Suppression of Communism Act made communism illegal. But what is communism by the definition of this law? All it is to be counted as communism, it just has to be anything that is anti-apartheid or anti-government. So again, very similar to how the civil rights groups in the United States were often branded as being communist, because how could any good, freedom-loving American have anything critical to say about the US government? Same exact thing happening here. Anyone who opposed apartheid or opposed the government in general was labeled a communist, and communism was made illegal. Now, this is complicated by the fact that some of the anti-apartheid activists were genuinely communist. Similarly, in the United States, you had some civil rights activists who were genuinely communist. And so that made it even easier to paint all of the anti-apartheid activists as communist, because you could point to the few that actually were and say, well, see, there you go. Here's an example. They say themselves that they are communist. So everyone here is communist. And I realize that probably sounds very silly, but again, the terror of communism during the Cold War cannot be overstated. And like you saw in the Ed puzzle, it is the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950. It is the labeling of all anti-apartheid activists as communist, and the support of the South African government for the First World and for the United States' general anti-communist rhetoric that will keep apartheid in place until after the Soviet Union collapses. The United States will never speak out against an ally who is helping them win the Cold War, especially if that would mean speaking out on behalf of people that have been labeled as communists. I also think it would be a little naive to expect the United States government to speak out on behalf of like civil rights activists in South Africa when you still weren't getting, civil rights getting a ton of support in the United States. But, that is a big part of why it isn't until the 90s that apartheid ends, because by the 90s, the Cold War has ended. The fear of communism is gone. And now the world can look at this horrible system of segregation and racism and say, I think you should stop.